A billionaire CEO broken by betrayal meets a little girl on a lonely road, her hands covered in grease, her eyes filled with pain. She has nothing, not even a home, yet she offers to fix his car in exchange for kindness. What begins as a chance encounter unravels a web of lies, conspiracies, and danger that could destroy them both. This is not just a story about wealth and power. It's about a promise, a bond stronger than blood, and how one little girl could change the heart of a man who thought he had everything, until he realized he had nothing at all. This is not just a story, it's a piece of someone's hidden pain, quietly waiting to be heard. In today's story, we dive into a moment that can change everything, in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Canada? The US? Norway? Let us know in the comments, because stories may begin anywhere, but they connect us all. Stay with us until the very end, because sometimes, what breaks your heart can also heal it. And if you believe stories can change lives, hit subscribe. Join our journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Your voice matters here. The night had fallen heavy over the city, blanketing the glass towers in a shimmer of cold silver. Neon lights flickered across the skyline, reflecting off wet asphalt that smelled of rain and oil. A long black Bentley rolled slowly out of the downtown district, its tinted windows hiding the man inside. Alexander Grant, CEO of Grant Industries, sat in the back seat, the glow of his tablet casting shadows across his sharp features. He was known as one of the most powerful men in the country. Untouchable in boardrooms, ruthless in negotiations, and wrapped in a silence that felt colder than the steel buildings he owned. The world whispered about his billions, but no one spoke of his loneliness. He closed the screen and leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his bones. The meeting he had just left had been another battlefield where he had won, but victories no longer brought him peace. His driver, Martin, guided the car onto the rural highway that cut through the outskirts of the city. It was the quickest route to the mansion that waited like an empty castle at the edge of the hills. That was when it happened. A sudden jerk. The Bentley coughed, rattled, and smoke billowed from under the hood. Martin cursed softly, pulling the car over to the shoulder of the dark, near, deserted road. "Engine trouble, sir," he muttered, stepping out into the damp air. Alexander sighed, annoyed. He wasn't used to inconveniences. He wasn't used to waiting. He reached for his phone, but the screen flashed low signal. No reception here. Typical. The night was quiet except for the hiss of the cooling engine. Then a sound. Small footsteps against gravel. From the shadows emerged a little figure. Thin, frail, no older than 9. A girl barefoot, wearing a tattered dress too light for the cold. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt, yet her eyes glowed with a fierce determination that startled him. She stopped a few feet from the Bentley, looking at the smoke curling from the hood. Her tiny hands were clenched into fists. "I can fix it," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to hold his attention. Martin frowned. "Run along, child. This is no place for you." But she didn't move. She lifted her chin and looked straight at Alexander, who had rolled the window down, curious. "I don't have money," she said, her voice stronger this time. "But I can fix engines. Please let me try." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. This was absurd. A little girl fixing a luxury car. Impossible. And yet something about her, her voice, her desperation, her refusal to back away, made him hesitate. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Why would you want to help me?" The girl's lip quivered. Her answer came like a knife, soft but cutting through the night air. "Because if I can fix your engine, maybe you'll help me find my father." The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness around them. And in that moment, Alexander Grant, a man who thought he had seen every negotiation, every trick, every plea for mercy, realized he had just stepped into the most unexpected story of his life. The mysterious little girl claims she can repair the billionaire's car in exchange for help finding her missing father. But what Alexander doesn't know is that her father's disappearance is tied to a secret that could shatter his empire. The wind was sharp on the empty highway, carrying the scent of wet earth and exhaust fumes. Martin bent over the hood, cursing under his breath as smoke curled into his face. Alexander remained seated in the back, his window lowered just enough to let in the cold air. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl who refused to move from the shadows of the road. She was trembling in the night air, but her gaze did not falter. Those eyes, large, brown, and weary, belonged to someone who had seen far too much for her age. Alexander noticed how her small hands, though thin, bore faint smudges of oil. She wasn't bluffing. She had touched engines before. "You said you can fix it." Alexander spoke at last, his voice smooth, controlled. "Prove it." The girl blinked in surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to agree. She rushed forward, barefoot on gravel, ignoring Martin's protests. Her fingers traced the edge of the Bentley's hood, then she leaned in with an odd mix of reverence and focus. "Step back," she whispered. "Engines don't like panic." Alexander raised a brow. "Engines don't like panic? What kind of child talked like that?" Martin scoffed, but he moved aside reluctantly. The girl reached deep into the smoking tangle of steel and wires. Her hands moved with instinct, her brows knitting in concentration. She coughed as smoke stung her lungs, but she didn't stop. Alexander watched, curiosity tugging at the corners of his otherwise unreadable face. He had spent his life surrounded by polished professionals, men and women who never spoke unless they rehearsed their lines. Yet here was a child, barefoot and ragged, working with a kind of raw determination that no boardroom could teach. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. "Lila. How old are you, Lila?" "9, almost 10. Her voice cracked slightly, but her hand stayed steady. She twisted a wire back into place, tightened a loose clamp, and tapped lightly against the battery casing as if speaking to it. "You said something about your father," Alexander pressed. "Why do you think I can help you find him?" At that, her shoulders stiffened. She stopped for a moment, eyes darting up to meet his. The vulnerability in her gaze pierced deeper than he expected. "Because you're powerful," she said simply. "People like you can find anyone." Before he could respond, the engine coughed. Then, against all odds, it roared back to life, rag but running. Martin's jaw fell open. Alexander leaned forward, genuinely stunned for the first time in years. The little girl wiped her hands on her dress, leaving streaks of grease on the faded fabric. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, she whispered almost to herself, "No, you owe me." Alexander studied her, the hum of the revived engine filling the silence. He had no idea that this small, desperate bargain would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, wealth, and himself. Who exactly is Lila? And what dark truth hides behind her missing father's disappearance? Alexander is about to learn that helping her may cost him more than money. It may cost him his carefully protected soul. The Bentley purred reluctantly, as though insulted to have been patched together by a child's hands. Martin muttered under his breath, glancing at Alexander through the rearview mirror. "Sir, we shouldn't entertain this. She's just..." "Quiet." Alexander cut him off. His voice wasn't raised, but its weight silenced any further argument. His gaze was locked on the girl standing on the shoulder of the road, shivering in the night breeze. Lila hugged her thin arms against her chest. The light from the car's headlights painted her in pale gold, outlining every bruise, every scrape, every crack in her fragile armor. She looked like she could collapse any second, yet something in her posture, chin raised, feet planted firm, spoke of a resilience Alexander couldn't ignore. "Get in," he said, her eyes widened. "In the car?" "Yes, unless you plan to walk barefoot all night." Martin started to protest again, but one sharp glance from Alexander shut him down. With hesitation, Lila slid into the passenger seat, her small body swallowed by the leather. She touched the door panel as though afraid her fingerprints might stain it. The silence inside the car was thick. Only the rhythmic hum of the engine filled the void. Finally, Alexander broke it. "You said your father is missing how long?" Her lips trembled. She looked down at her hands, still smudged with grace. 2 weeks. He went to work and didn't come home." "What kind of work?" Lila hesitated. "Engines, cars. He fixes things like I do." "But?" Her voice faltered. "He took a job he didn't want to. He said he needed the money. Then he was gone." Alexander studied her carefully. Something in her story felt rehearsed, as though she had learned what not to say. "Did you tell the police?" "They don't care," she whispered bitterly. "They said he probably left. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't leave me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, Alexander saw the child beneath the steel mask. Alone, frightened. Holding herself together with nothing but sheer will, he turned his gaze out the window. Why was he even entertaining this? He had meetings, empires to run, and a life built on never getting entangled in other people's chaos. Yet here he was, listening to the plea of a girl who had nothing but stubborn faith in her father. Martin cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Sir, should I take her to the authorities? Or perhaps a shelter?" Before Alexander could answer, Lila's head snapped up, her voice desperate. "No, please, not a shelter. Just help me find him. You owe me, remember?" Her words echoed like a challenge. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the unfamiliar weight of obligation. Not the kind dictated by contracts or shareholders, but the raw, human kind that unsettled his carefully ordered life. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing with thought. "I'll decide," he said finally, his tone unreadable. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Alexander is drawn deeper into Lila's desperate world. But when he starts looking into her father's disappearance, he uncovers a disturbing connection. One that leads directly back to his own empire. Morning light spilled across the skyline, striking the glass walls of Grant Tower like liquid fire. From his corner office on the top floor, Alexander stared down at the restless city below. The events of the night before replayed in his mind like a broken record. The smoke, the little girl, her trembling voice asking him to help. He had intended to drop her at a shelter before dawn, yet when the car reached his estate, she had fallen asleep in the back seat. Not the restless sleep of a child, but the heavy, exhausted collapse of someone who hadn't closed her eyes in days. Against his better judgment, he had let her stay in one of the guest rooms. Now she was still there, curled up in sheets far too fine for someone who had learned to live with so little. Alexander rubbed his temples. He had work to do, deals to secure, boardrooms to dominate. He did not have time for strays with missing fathers. And yet, Grant, a voice interrupted. Martin stepped into the office, holding a thin file. You asked me to check into the girl's father. Leela Matthews. Alexander's head lifted slowly. What did you find? Martin hesitated, a rare thing for a man not easily shaken. Her father's name is Samuel Matthews. Auto mechanic, mostly freelance work, but 6 months ago he took a contract job. Alexander frowned. With whom? Martin slid the file across the polished desk. A single name was printed in black letters. Grant Industries. Alexander's jaw tightened. He flipped the page, scanning quickly. Samuel Matthews had been hired by one of his subsidiaries, tasked with maintenance work on specialized vehicles used for internal transport. Nothing remarkable. Nothing worth remembering. Yet the record showed something strange. Samuel had stopped reporting for work exactly 2 weeks ago. The same time Leela said he vanished. Did he quit? Alexander asked. There's no resignation on file, Martin replied. And no official termination either. He just disappeared. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Alexander's chest. His empire was a machine, one that ran on precision and documentation. People didn't just vanish from its records. Do you think the girl knows? Martin asked carefully. Alexander closed the file, his expression unreadable. No, if she did she would have said. But inside, his thoughts churned. This wasn't coincidence. The child who had appeared out of the darkness, begging to fix his engine, was tied to his world in ways neither of them yet understood. He rose from his chair, staring once more out the window at the city that bowed to his name. For the first time in years, he felt a thread of unease pulling at his certainty. If Samuel Matthews had disappeared inside his empire, then helping Leela wouldn't just be charity. It would be stepping into the shadows of his own making. Alexander decides to trace Samuel Matthews' last known steps, but the deeper he looks, the more he realizes that someone inside Grant Industries doesn't want the truth uncovered, and they are willing to silence anyone who asks. The morning sun did little to soften the cold stone walls of the Grant estate. In the guest room at the far end of the hall, Leela sat cross-legged on the edge of a bed far too large for her small frame. The silk sheets tangled around her legs, a stark contrast to the ragged clothes she had worn the night before. She stared at the patterns in the carpet, lost in thought, until a soft knock came at the door. Alexander stepped in, his presence filling the room. He was dressed in a dark suit, his usual armor, but there was something different in his eyes, something less detached, more searching. You slept, he said simply. Leela nodded, though her shoulders hunched as if bracing for reproach. I didn't mean to. I was just tired. He studied her, the fragility in her voice tugging at something he had buried long ago. Instead of answering, he extended a small plate of food. Toast, fruit, eggs all arranged neatly. Eat, he said. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she hesitated, as though the gesture might vanish as she reached for it. Then hunger won. She ate quickly, almost too quickly, and Alexander turned away, uncomfortable with the raw need displayed so openly. I looked into your father, he said, his voice low. He worked for one of my companies. The fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes darted to his. You know where he is? No, Alexander admitted. But I know where to start. He left the room before she could press further. Some truths needed shadows to grow before they could bear light. Later that day, Alexander strode through the industrial district where Samuel Matthews had last been recorded. The building loomed ahead, a warehouse belonging to a Grant subsidiary, its metal walls streaked with rust. The air smelled of fuel and scorched rubber. Inside, the space was cavernous and empty. Dust motes drifted like ghosts in the shafts of sunlight piercing the high windows. A few abandoned workbenches lined the walls, scattered with tools that hadn't been touched in weeks. Strange, Martin murmured, scanning the room. It's like they shut everything down overnight. Alexander moved slowly, his eyes catching details others might miss. A smudge of oil where no car had sat, a half-crushed pack of cigarettes, a coffee cup with Samuel's name scribbled in faded marker. He picked it up, his grip tightening. The man had been here. This was no ordinary absence. Before he could speak, a sharp sound cut through the silence, the crack of a door slamming shut somewhere deeper in the building. Martin reached for the gun at his side, his body tensing. Alexander's jaw hardened. Whoever was here didn't want them digging. For the first time, Alexander felt the faint spark of something he hadn't known in years. Not fear, but the thrill of danger. And behind it all, one thought: if Samuel Matthews had vanished because of something inside his empire, Then protecting Lila would mean standing against forces buried in his own foundations. Alexander and Martin pursue the mysterious sound inside the warehouse, only to uncover evidence that Samuel's disappearance is tied to something far darker than missing employees. Something that points to sabotage, betrayal, and enemies within. The slam of the distant door echoed through the hollow warehouse, reverberating off the steel walls like a warning. Alexander's eyes sharpened, scanning the dim corridors branching off from the main floor. Dust stirred in the air, disturbed by movement too recent to be coincidence. "Stay close," Alexander murmured. Martin's hand stayed near his holster as they advanced, each footstep crunching against gravel and broken glass. The warehouse had the feel of abandonment, but it wasn't empty. Shadows shifted in the corners, hinting at the presence of someone watching. They followed the sound through a narrow hallway lined with storage lockers. A faint flicker of light leaked from beneath one of the doors, barely visible but enough to catch Alexander's eye. He motioned to Martin, and together they approached in silence. Alexander pushed the door open. Inside was a cramped office, its walls stained with mildew and lined with filing cabinets. A single lamp burned weakly on the desk, illuminating a scattering of papers. But what froze Alexander's breath was what lay across the desk itself, a stack of employee files, each marked with a red stamp, terminated. And among them, Samuel Matthews' file sat on top. The termination date was blank. His photograph stared back, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and grease still visible on his collar. Beneath the image, a note scribbled hastily in pen read Z. "Do not release." Alexander's jaw clenched. This wasn't standard procedure. Someone had deliberately hidden the man's disappearance. A creak on the floorboards behind them snapped his attention back. He turned sharply, catching only the glimpse of a figure slipping out the far door. "Stop!" Martin shouted, rushing forward. The chase exploded into motion, their footsteps pounding against the hollow floor. The figure darted through the maze of corridors, quick and desperate, but not quick enough. At last, Martin tackled him near the loading bay, forcing him to the ground. The man thrashed, his hood slipping back to reveal a pale, gaunt face, eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his voice like steel. The man panted, sweat dripping down his forehead. "You shouldn't be here, none of you should. They'll see you. They'll know." "Who?" The man's eyes darted to the shadows as though afraid they were listening. "The ones who made Matthews disappear. The ones inside your company." Alexander's blood chilled. "What do they want?" But before the man could answer, a sharp crack split the air. A gunshot. The man's body jerked violently, then slumped lifeless against the ground. Martin cursed, pulling Alexander behind cover. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. Whoever had silenced the informant was gone before they could pursue. Alexander stared at the corpse, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a missing mechanic anymore. Someone inside Grand Industries was cleaning house. And now they knew Alexander was asking questions. Back at the estate, Lila waits for answers, unaware of the danger closing in. But Alexander now faces a choice: protect his empire's image, or risk everything to uncover the truth behind Samuel Matthews' disappearance. The Bentley rolled back into the estate long after dusk, its headlights cutting through the mist that clung to the hills. Alexander stepped out first, his face carved with the same stillness he wore in boardrooms, but inside his thoughts were in turmoil. The man in the warehouse had been silenced before he could speak, and the name, Matthews, now echoed through Alexander's empire like a fault line threatening to split. Martin lingered near the car, his voice low. "Sir, if this goes any further, it won't be safe. Whoever killed that man, they knew we'd be there." Alexander didn't reply. His gaze shifted to the mansion's second floor, where a faint light glowed from the guest room window. Lila was awake, waiting. He climbed the stairs slowly, his polished shoes muted by the thick carpets. When he opened the door, the girl sat huddled on the edge of the bed, a blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her eyes were wide, hopeful, but shadowed with fear. "Did you find him?" she asked immediately. Alexander hesitated, something he rarely allowed himself to do. "Not yet." Her shoulders sank, the light in her face dimming. She stared at her hands, still stained faintly with grease despite washing. "People don't want to help. They don't care. I thought maybe you." Her voice trailed off. For a moment, Alexander saw not just a child, but a mirror. Someone who had been abandoned by the world's indifference, forced to build walls around her heart. He thought of his own childhood, of a father too consumed by ambition to notice the boy in his shadow. "I don't break promises, Lila," he said at last, his voice softer than he intended. "I will find out what happened to your father. But you must trust me." Her head lifted slowly, "even if it's dangerous." The question struck him harder than it should have. She knew. She sensed the weight of the storm gathering, and yet she was still asking for reassurance. "Yes," he answered firmly, "even if it's dangerous." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Lila shifted closer, her small voice carrying more strength than her thin frame suggested. Then I'll trust you. Alexander turned away, unsettled by the tightness in his chest. He had built an empire on control, on removing emotion from every decision. But with this girl, every wall he had constructed was beginning to crack. Downstairs, Martin poured himself a stiff drink, his eyes wary. He knew his employer well enough to see the shift. Alexander Grant was no longer simply investigating a missing employee. He was becoming entangled in something deeply personal. And in a world where power drew enemies like moths to flame, personal attachments were the most dangerous weakness of all. As Alexander digs deeper, he uncovers documents linking Samuel Matthews to a secret project within Grant Industries, one that could destroy both his empire and Leela's fragile hope. But someone else is already watching, waiting for Alexander to cross the line. The next morning, the estate was cloaked in fog, the gardens outside Alexander's study blurred like watercolor. He sat at his desk, the file on Samuel Matthews spread open before him. Every page felt heavier than it should have, as if the paper itself carried secrets. Samuel's employment history was simple, too simple. Routine maintenance, standard checks, minor repairs. Yet attached to the back of the file was a restricted access clearance slip, stamped with the seal of one of Grant Industries' most confidential branches, Division K. Alexander's brow furrowed. Division K specialized in experimental transport technology, contracts so sensitive that even senior executives weren't briefed without his permission. He didn't recall authorizing a mechanic's clearance. Someone had forced the papers through. Martin entered quietly, a tablet in hand. I cross-checked Matthews' records. He wasn't just fixing engines. He was assigned to Project Helix. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Helix hasn't even been approved for testing. Exactly, Martin said. But Matthews had access, and then he disappeared. The weight of it settled on Alexander's chest. Project Helix wasn't just another venture. It was a prototype energy system that could rewrite transportation across the globe. Billions of dollars, government contracts, international attention. If Matthews had been involved, and if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to, a knock at the study door interrupted them. Leela stood hesitantly in the doorway, her small hands clutching the frame. I heard you talking, she said softly. Helix, is that why my dad's gone? Alexander's instinct was to shield her, to dismiss the question. But the raw fear in her eyes demanded honesty. Your father worked on something important, he admitted carefully. Something people would hide to protect. Her lips pressed into a thin line. So they took him. The conviction in her voice startled him. It wasn't a question, it was certainty. Children, he realized, had a way of sensing truths adults spent their lives denying. He rose, walking to the tall windows. Beyond them, the fog lifted slowly, revealing the sharp edges of the world. If that's true, he said, then we're not just searching for a missing man. We're walking into a battlefield. Behind him, Leela whispered, I don't care. He's all I have. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. She didn't know how close her words cut. For all his wealth and influence, he too had once searched for something, someone, to fill the silence. Martin cleared his throat. Sir, if Division K is involved, you can't go in openly. Whoever authorized Matthews' clearance will know you're looking. We'll need to move quietly. Alexander turned back, his decision already made. Then we move quietly. But as the fog thinned, revealing the city beyond, he had the unsettling sense that someone was already moving against him, watching, waiting for him to take one wrong step. When Alexander and Martin dig into Division K's records, they uncover a hidden list of names connected to Project Helix, men who vanished just like Samuel. And one of those names is someone Alexander never expected to see. The records room of Division K was buried deep beneath one of Grant Industries' oldest buildings. Few employees even knew it existed. Concrete walls sweated with damp, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Alexander and Martin descended into the archive. The air smelled of paper and dust, heavy with years of forgotten secrets. Rows of filing cabinets stretched endlessly, a graveyard of projects too dangerous to surface. Alexander moved with purpose, but his chest was tight. He had walked through countless rooms of his empire, yet this place felt foreign, hostile, like a kingdom within his kingdom. Martin unlocked a drawer marked Helix Restricted Access. Inside, stacks of personnel files were bound together, each labeled with a clearance number. Alexander flipped through quickly, his eyes sharp. Samuel Matthews' file was there, identical to the one they had found before. Except this copy had been marked with a thick black slash across the front. Beneath it, other names appeared. Look at this, Martin muttered, pulling several files free. One by one, they spread across the desk. Men and women, all from modest backgrounds, mechanics, engineers, technicians. Each had been given temporary access to Project Helix, and every one of them had vanished within the past 6 months. No resignation forms, no termination notices, just silence. Alexander's pulse quickened. This isn't incompetence, it's deliberate. His fingers stopped on one file. The name froze him in place, Jonathan Hale. Alexander's jaw tightened. Jonathan Hale wasn't just another technician. He had once been one of Alexander's brightest protégés, a man who had risen quickly through the company ranks before suddenly leaving 2 years ago. No explanation. No farewell. Just gone? Martin asked, noticing the change in his expression. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He opened Hale's file, scanning the details. Assigned to Project Helix 6 months ago. Clearance approved by an executive committee Alexander had never signed off on. And then disappearance. The same black slash marked the cover. Alexander's thoughts churned. Jonathan had been more than an employee. He had been someone Alexander believed in, someone who shared his vision. If Jonathan had been pulled into this, and erased like the others, then the conspiracy wasn't just about missing workers. It was about silencing anyone who knew too much. Behind him, Martin's voice dropped. Sir, this means the cover-up goes deeper. Someone inside your own board authorized these clearances. Someone close. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting sharp shadows across the files. Alexander stared down at the names, each one a ghost tied to his empire, and for the first time he felt the ground shift beneath him. His fortune, his companies, his very legacy. All of it was being used to hide something monstrous. He closed the file with a snap, his voice low and hard. Find out who signed off on these clearances. Quietly, no one outside this room knows. But even as he said it, he felt the eyes of unseen watchers pressing in. Whoever orchestrated these disappearances wasn't finished. And now Alexander Grant was no longer a bystander. He was a target. Back at the estate, strange events begin to unfold around Leela, unseen figures, a phone call cut short, a shadow in the garden at night. Alexander realizes that the closer he gets to the truth, the more danger follows the little girl he swore to protect. The night air was still around the Grant estate, the gardens hushed beneath a silver wash of moonlight. From her window, Leela pressed her small hands against the glass, watching the hedges sway in the breeze. At first she thought it was nothing, just leaves shifting. But then, a darker shape moved between the trees. Slow, intentional. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled the curtains shut and backed away from the window, her heart thudding. For days she had felt it, that prickle at the back of her neck, the sense of being watched. Tonight it was real. Downstairs, Alexander sat in his study, files spread across the desk like battle plans. He had pieced together fragments of Division Case secrets, but the picture was still incomplete. His mind was sharp, but his chest carried a weight he hadn't known in years. Every step closer to the truth endangered the girl sleeping under his roof. The creak of hurried footsteps broke his thoughts. Leela appeared in the doorway, her blanket wrapped around her like a shield. Someone's outside, she whispered, her voice trembling. Alexander stood immediately. Martin appeared a moment later, his instincts honed from years of protecting his employer. We're in the garden, she said by the trees. Martin moved swiftly, hand on his weapon, disappearing down the hall toward the back entrance. Alexander knelt in front of Leela, steadying her shoulders. Stay here, he said firmly. But Leela shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes. They're here for me, aren't they? Because of my dad? The words pierced Alexander like a blade. She wasn't wrong. Whoever was behind this knew she was the last loose thread, and she had come under his protection. Outside, Martin's footsteps faded into the night. A moment later, a sharp crack split the silence, a branch snapping under weight. Then another sound, the faint hum of a car engine idling somewhere beyond the hedges. Alexander moved to the window, parting the curtains just enough to glimpse movement in the shadows. A figure dressed in black lingered near the far gate, watching the house. Another shadow shifted closer, crouched low. This wasn't imagination. This was surveillance. He closed the curtain quickly and turned back to Leela. Her face was pale, her small fists clenched with fear. You promised, she whispered. You promised you'd keep me safe? And in that moment, Alexander Grant, a man who had never bowed to threats, felt the full weight of that promise. Martin returned, his expression grim. They're testing us. Watching the perimeter. Whoever it is, they want us to know we're not alone. Alexander's jaw tightened. Then let them watch. But we'll decide what they see. He placed a hand on Leela's shoulder, his voice low but steady. No matter what happens, they won't take you. Not while I'm here. Yet even as he spoke the words, a chilling realization crept in. The war wasn't waiting at his company anymore. It had already arrived at his door. As danger closes in on the estate, Alexander must face the hidden traitor inside his empire and uncover the truth about Samuel Matthews. But the final revelation will force him to choose between saving his legacy or saving the little girl who trusts him with her life. The storm broke just before dawn. Rain hammered the windows of the Grant estate, thunder rolling across the hills like distant drums of war. Inside, Alexander stood at the head of the study table, the files on Project Helix spread before him. Every piece pointed to one truth. The conspiracy lived inside his empire. And if he didn't cut it out, it would consume everything, including Leela. Martin entered, water dripping from his coat. I traced the clearance approvals. Only one executive had authority to push them through without your signature. Alexander's eyes hardened. Who? The name landed like a stone in his chest. Ethan Ward. His most trusted board member, the man who had stood at his side for over a decade. The betrayal burned deeper than he expected. Before he could speak, a sharp sound cut through the storm. The shatter of glass upstairs. Lila. They raced up the staircase. At the end of the hall, her room door stood open, curtains whipping in the wind. A rope dangled from the broken window, swaying in the rain. The bed was empty. Alexander's blood ran cold. They followed the trail through the gardens, mud clinging to their shoes. Headlights flared in the distance. A black SUV waiting beyond the gates. Two figures dragged Lila toward it, her cries muffled by the storm. Stop! Alexander roared, his voice tearing through the night. The men froze just long enough for Martin to draw his weapon. A shot rang out, striking the ground near their feet. One fled, but the other shoved Lila toward the car, desperate to escape. Alexander surged forward, his fury greater than fear. He tore the man back, fists clenched, and for a moment the storm itself seemed to bow to the weight of his rage. The man crumpled under the force, retreating into the shadows. Lila stumbled into Alexander's arms, shaking, her tears mixing with rain. I knew they'd come, she sobbed. I knew? He held her tightly, his voice breaking despite himself. Not while I'm here. Not ever. Not behind them. The SUV's engine roared to life. Through the tinted window, Alexander caught a glimpse of Ethan Ward himself, expression calm, almost mocking. Then the car sped into the storm, disappearing down the road. Back inside, drenched and breathless, Martin spoke the words Alexander already knew. Ward won't stop. He knows you're onto him. Alexander looked down at Lila, clutching his shirt with trembling hands. She was all that remained of Samuel Matthews' life, and now the only leverage Ward would seek to break him. For the first time, Alexander understood the choice before him. He could fight for his empire, his billions, his reputation. Or he could fight for the little girl who had appeared on a dark highway, begging to fix his engine, and unknowingly fixed something far more broken inside him. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his decision clear. We'll bring him down, he whispered, for your father. For you. When in Lila's eyes, through fear and tears, a spark of hope returned. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of the grand estate, a new battle had begun. One not for wealth or power, but for truth, family, and the promises that could never be broken.